Section 18 of Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, Volume 7, by Lucius Mestrius PLUTARCHUS. Translated by Bernadotte PERRIN. Chapters 28 to 42 of Caesar. Now Caesar had long ago decided to put down Pompey, just as, of course, Pompey had also decided to put Caesar down. For now that Crassus, who was only waiting for the issue of their struggle to engage the victor, had perished among the Parthians, it remained for him who would be greatest to put down him who was, and for him who was greatest, if he would not be put down, to take off in time the man he feared. This fear had only recently come upon Pompey, who till then despised Caesar, feeling that it was no hard task to put down again the man whom he himself had raised on high. But Caesar had from the outset formed this design, and like an athlete had removed himself to a great distance from his antagonists, and by exercising himself in the Gallic wars, had practiced his troops and increased his fame, lifting himself by his achievements to a height where he could vie with the successes of Pompey. He laid hold of pretexts which were furnished partly by Pompey himself, and partly by the times and the evil state of government at Rome, by reason of which candidates for office set up counting tables in public and shamelessly bribed the multitudes, while the people went down into the forum under pay, contending in behalf of their paymaster, not with votes, but with bows and arrows, swords and slings. Often, too, they would defile the rostra with blood and corpses before they separated, leaving the city to anarchy, like a ship drifting about without a steersman, so that men of understanding were content if matters issued in nothing worse for them than monarchy, after such madness and so great a tempest. And there were many who actually dared to say in public that nothing but monarchy could now cure the diseases of the state, and that this remedy ought to be adopted when offered by the gentlest of physicians, hinting at Pompey, and when even Pompey, although in words he affected to decline the honor, in fact did more than anyone else to effect his appointment as dictator. Cato saw through his design and persuaded the Senate to appoint him sole consul, solacing him with a more legal monarchy, that he might not force his way to the dictatorship. They also voted him additional time in which to hold his provinces, and he had two, Spain and all Africa, which he managed by sending legates thither and maintaining armies there, for which he received from the public treasury 1,000 talents annually. Chapter 29. Consequently, Caesar canvassed by proxy for a consulship, and likewise for an extension of time in which to hold his own provinces. At first, then, Pompey held his peace, while Marcellus and Lentulus opposed these plans. They hated Caesar on other grounds, and went beyond all bounds in their efforts to bring dishonor and abuse upon him. For instance, the inhabitants of Novum Comum, a colony recently established by Caesar in Gaul, were deprived of citizenship by them, and Marcellus, while he was consul, beat with rods a senator of Novum Comum who had come to Rome, telling him besides that he put these marks upon him to prove that he was not a Roman, and bade him go back and show them to Caesar. But after the consulship of Marcellus, Caesar, having now sent his Gallic wealth for all those in public life to draw from in copious streams, and having freed Curio the tribune from many debts, and having given Paulus the consul 1,500 talents, out of which he adorned the forum with the basilica. Footnote: the Basilica of Pauli Aemilii, called also Regia Pauli, It took the place of the Basilica Aemilia at Fulvia, erected in 179 BC. End footnote. A famous monument erected in place of the Fulvia. Under these circumstances, Pompey took fright at the coalition, and openly now, by his own efforts and those of his friends, tried to have a successor appointed to Caesar in his government, and sent a demand to him for the return of the soldiers whom he had lent him for his Gallic contests. Caesar sent the soldiers back, after making a present to each man of 250 drachmas. But the officers who brought these men to Pompey spread abroad among the multitude stories regarding Caesar, which were neither reasonable nor true, and ruined Pompey himself with vain hopes. They told him that Caesar's army yearned for him, and that while he was with difficulty controlling affairs in the city owing to the disease of envy which festered in the body politic, the forces in Gaul were ready to serve him, and had but to cross into Italy when they would at once be on his side. So obnoxious to them had Caesar become by reason of the multitude of his campaigns, and so suspicious of him were they made by their fear of a monarchy. All this fed Pompey's vanity, and he neglected to provide himself with soldiers, as though he had no fears, while with speeches and resolutions of the Senate he was carrying the day against Caesar, as he supposed, although he was merely getting measures rejected about which Caesar cared not. Nay, we are told that one of the centurions sent to Rome by Caesar, as he stood in front of the Senate house and learned that the Senate would not give Caesar an extension of his term of command, slapped the handle of his sword and said, "But this will give it." Chapter 30. However, the demands which came from Caesar certainly had a striking semblance of fairness. He demanded, namely, that if he himself laid down his arms, Pompey should do the same, and that both, thus become private men, should find what favor they could with their fellow citizens, arguing that if they took away his forces from him, but confirmed Pompey in the possession of his, they would be accusing one of seeking a tyranny, and making the other a tyrant. When Curio laid these proposals before the people in behalf of Caesar, he was loudly applauded, and some actually cast garlands of flowers upon him, as if he were a victorious athlete. Antony, too, who was a tribune, brought before the people a letter of Caesar's on these matters, which he had received, and read it aloud, in defiance of the consuls. But in the Senate, Scipio, the father-in-law of Pompey, footnote, Pompey had married Cornelia, the young widow of Publius Crassus, end footnote, introduced a motion that if by a fixed day Caesar did not lay down his arms, he should be declared a public enemy. And when the consuls put the question whether Pompey should dismiss his soldiers, and again whether Caesar should, very few senators voted for the first, and all but a few for the second. But when Antony again demanded that both should give up their commands, all with one accord assented. Scipio, however, made violent opposition, and Lentulus, the consul, cried out that against a robber there was need of arms, not votes, whereupon the Senate broke up, and the senators put on the garb of mourning in view of the dissension. Chapter 31. But presently letters came from Caesar in which he appeared to take a more moderate position, for he agreed to surrender everything else, but demanded that Cisalpine Gaul and Illyricum, together with 2 legions, should be given him until he stood for his second consulship. Cicero the orator, too, who had just returned from Cilicia and was busy with a reconciliation, tried to mollify Pompey, who yielded everything else, but insisted on taking away Caesar's soldiers. Cicero also tried to persuade the friends of Caesar to compromise and come to a settlement on the basis of the provinces mentioned and only 6,000 soldiers, and Pompey was ready to yield and grant so many. Lentulus, the consul, however, would not let him, but actually heaped insults upon Antony and Curio, and drove them disgracefully from the Senate, thus himself contriving for Caesar the most specious of his pretexts, and the one by means of which he most of all incited his soldiers, showing them men of repute and high office, who had fled the city on hired carts and in the garb of slaves, for thus they had arrayed themselves in their fear and stolen out of Rome. Chapter 32. Now Caesar had with him not more than 300 horsemen and 5,000 legionaries, for the rest of his army had been left beyond the Alps, and was to be brought up by those whom he had sent for the purpose. He saw, however, that the beginning of his enterprise and its initial step did not require a large force at present, but must take advantage of the golden moment by showing amazing boldness and speed, since he could strike terror into his enemies by an unexpected blow more easily than he could overwhelm them by an attack in full force. He therefore ordered his centurions and other officers, taking their swords only, and without the rest of their arms, to occupy Ariminum, a large city of Gaul, avoiding commotion and bloodshed as far as possible, and he entrusted this force to Hortensius. He himself spent the day in public, attending and watching the exercises of gladiators. But a little before evening he bathed and dressed and went into the banqueting hall. Here he held brief converse with those who had been invited to supper, and just as it was getting dark, rose and went away, after addressing courteously most of his guests and bidding them await his return. To a few of his friends, however, he had previously given directions to follow him, not all by the same route, but some by one way and some by another. He himself mounted one of his hired carts and drove at first along another road, then turned toward Ariminum. When he came to the river which separates Cisalpine Gaul from the rest of Italy, it is called the Rubicon, he began to reflect, now that he drew nearer to the fearful step, and was agitated by the magnitude of his ventures. He checked his speed. Then, halting in his course, he communed with himself a long time in silence, as his resolution wavered back and forth, and his purpose then suffered change after change. For a long time, too, he discussed his perplexities with his friends who were present, among whom was Asinius Pollio, estimating the great evils for all mankind which would follow their passage of the river, and the wide fame of it which they would leave to posterity. But finally, with a sort of passion, as if abandoning calculation and casting himself upon the future, and uttering the phrase with which men usually prelude their plunge into desperate and daring fortunes, "Let the die be cast," he hastened to cross the river, and going at full speed now for the rest of the time, before daybreak he dashed into Ariminum and took possession of it. It is said, moreover, that on the night before he crossed the river he had an unnatural dream. He thought, namely, that he was having incestuous intercourse with his own mother. Footnote. According to Suetonius, Caesar had this dream while he was quaestor in Spain. The interpreters of dreams told him that his mother meant the earth, the universal parent, which was to become subject to him. End footnote. Chapter 33. After the seizure of Ariminum, as if the war had opened with broad gates to cover the whole earth and sea alike, and the laws of the state were confounded along with the boundaries of the province, one would not have thought that men and women, as at other times, were hurrying through Italy in consternation, but that the very cities had risen up in flight and were rushing one through another, while Rome herself, deluged as it were by the inhabitants of the surrounding towns who were fleeing from their homes, neither readily obeying a magistrate nor listening to the voice of reason, in the surges of a mighty sea, narrowly escaped being overturned by her own internal agitations, for conflicting emotions and violent disturbances prevailed everywhere. Those who rejoiced did not keep quiet, but in many places, as was natural in a great city, encountered those who were in fear and distress, and, being filled with confidence as to the future, came into strife with them, while Pompey himself, who was terror-stricken, was assailed on every side, being taken to task by some for having strengthened Caesar against himself and the supreme power of the state, and denounced by others for having permitted Lentulus to insult Caesar when he was ready to yield and was offering reasonable terms of settlement. Favonius bade him stamp on the ground. For once, in a boastful speech to the Senate, he told them to take no trouble or anxious thought about preparations for the war, since when it came he had but to stamp upon the earth to fill Italy with armies. However, even then Pompey's forces were more numerous than Caesar's, but no one would suffer him to exercise his own judgment, and so, under the influence of many false and terrifying reports, believing that the war was already close at hand and prevailed everywhere, he gave way, was swept along with the universal tide, issued an edict declaring a state of anarchy, and forsook the city, commanding the Senate to follow, and forbidding anyone to remain who preferred country and freedom to tyranny. Chapter 34. Accordingly, the consuls fled, without even making the sacrifices usual before departure. Most of the senators also fled, after seizing, in a sort of robbery, whatever came to hand of their own possessions, as though it were the property of others. Some, too, who before this had vehemently espoused the cause of Caesar, were now frightened out of their wits, and were carried along, when there was no need of it, by the sweep of the great tide. But most pitiful was the sight of the city, now that so great a tempest was bearing down upon her, carried along like a ship abandoned of her helmsman, to dash against whatever lay in her path. Still, although their removal was so pitiful a thing, for the sake of Pompey, men considered exile to be their country, and abandoned Rome with the feeling that it was Caesar's camp. For even Labienus, one of Caesar's greatest friends, who had been his legate, and had fought most zealously with him in all his Gallic wars, now ran away from him and came to Pompey. But Caesar sent to Labienus his money and his baggage. Against Domitius, however, who was holding Corfinium with 30 cohorts under his command, he marched and pitched his camp nearby. Domitius, despairing of his enterprise, asked his physician, who was a slave, for a poison, and taking what was given him, drank it, intending to die. But after a little, hearing that Caesar showed most wonderful clemency towards his prisoners, he bewailed his fate and blamed the rashness of his purpose. Then his physician bade him be of good cheer, since what he had drunk was a sleeping potion and not deadly. Whereupon Domitius rose up overjoyed and went to Caesar, the pledge of whose right hand he received, only to desert him and go back to Pompey. When tidings of these things came to Rome, men were made more cheerful, and some of the fugitives turned back. Chapter 35. Caesar took over the troops of Domitius, as well as all the other levies of Pompey which he surprised in the various cities. Then, since his forces were already numerous and formidable, he marched against Pompey himself. Pompey, however, did not await his approach, but fled to Brundisium, sent the consuls before him with an army to Dyrrhachium, and shortly afterwards, as Caesar drew near, sailed off himself, as shall be set forth circumstantially in his life. Caesar wished to pursue him at once, but was destitute of ships. So he turned back to Rome, having in 60 days and without bloodshed become master of all Italy. He found the city more tranquil than he was expecting, and many senators in it. With these, therefore, he conferred in a gentle and affable manner, inviting them even to send a deputation to Pompey, proposing suitable terms of agreement. But no one would listen to him, either because they feared Pompey, whom they had abandoned, or because they thought that Caesar did not mean what he said, but was indulging in specious talk. When the tribune Metellus tried to prevent Caesar's taking money from the reserve funds of the state and cited certain laws, Caesar said that arms and laws had not the same season. But if thou art displeased at what is going on, for the present get out of the way, since war has no use for free speech. When, however, I have come to terms and laid down my arms, then thou shalt come before the people with thy harangues. And in saying this, I waive my own just rights, for thou art mine, thou and all of the faction hostile to me, whom I have caught. After this speech to Metellus, Caesar walked towards the door of the treasury, and when the keys were not to be found, he sent for smiths and ordered them to break in the door. Metellus once more opposed him, and was commended by some for so doing. But Caesar, raising his voice, threatened to kill him if he did not cease his troublesome interference. "And thou surely knowest, young man," said he, "that it is more unpleasant for me to say this than to do it." Then Metellus, in consequence of this speech, went off in a fright, and henceforth everything was speedily and easily furnished to Caesar for the war. Chapter 36. So he made an expedition into Spain, having resolved first to drive out from there Afranius and Varro, Pompey's legates, and bring their forces there and the provinces into his power, and then to march against Pompey, leaving not an enemy in his rear. And though his life was often in peril from ambuscades, and his army most of all from hunger, he did not cease from pursuing, challenging, and besieging the men until he had made himself by main force master of their camps and their forces. The leaders, however, made their escape to Pompey. Chapter 37. When Caesar came back to Rome, Piso, his father-in-law, urged him to send a deputation to Pompey with proposals for a settlement. But Isauricus, to please Caesar, opposed the project. So having been made dictator by the Senate, he brought home exiles, restored to civic rights the children of those who had suffered in the time of Sulla, relieved the burdens of the debtor class by a certain adjustment of interest, took in hand a few other public measures of like character, and within 11 days abdicated the sole power, had himself declared consul with Servilius Isauricus, and entered upon his campaign. The rest of his forces he passed by in a forced march, and with 600 picked horsemen and 5 legions, at the time of the winter solstice, in the earliest part of January, 48 B.C., the Roman calendar at this time was much in advance of the solar seasons. This month answers nearly to the Athenian Poseidion. Put to sea, and after crossing the Ionian Gulf, took Oricum and Apollonia, and sent his transports back again to Brundisium for the soldiers who had been belated on their march. These, as long as they were on the road, since they were now past their physical prime and worn out with their multitudinous wars, murmured against Caesar. "Whither, pray, and to what end will this man bring us, hurrying us about and treating us like tireless and lifeless things? Even a sword gets tired out with smiting, and shield and breastplate are spared a little after so long a time of service. Will not even our wounds, then, convince Caesar that he commands mortal men, and that we are mortal in the endurance of pain and suffering? Surely the wintry season and the occasion of a storm at sea, not even a god can constrain. Yet this man takes risks, as though he were not pursuing, but flying from enemies." With such words as these, they marched in a leisurely way to Brundisium. But when they got there and found that Caesar had put to sea, they quickly changed their tone and reviled themselves as traitors to the imperator. They reviled their officers, too, for not having quickened their march. Then, sitting on the cliffs, they looked off toward the open sea and Epirus, watching for the ships which were to carry them across to their commander. Chapter 38. at Apollonia, since the force which he had with him was not a match for the enemy, and the delay of his troops on the other side caused him perplexity and distress, Caesar conceived the dangerous plan of embarking in a 12-oared boat without anyone's knowledge, and going over to Brundisium, though the sea was encompassed by such large armaments of the enemy. At night, accordingly, after disguising himself in the dress of a slave, he went on board, threw himself down as one of no account, and kept quiet. While the river Aus was carrying the boat down towards the sea, the early morning breeze, which at that time usually made the mouth of the river calm by driving back the waves, was quelled by a strong wind which blew from the sea during the night. The river, therefore, chafed against the inflow of the sea and the opposition of its billows, and was rough, being beaten back with a great din and violent eddies, so that it was impossible for the master of the boat to force his way along. He therefore ordered the sailors to come about in order to retrace his course. But Caesar, perceiving this, disclosed himself, took the master of the boat by the hand, who was terrified at sight of him, and said, "Come, good man, be bold, and fear not. Thou carriest Caesar and Caesar's fortune in thy boat." The sailors forgot the storm, and laying to their oars, tried with all alacrity to force their way down the river. But since it was impossible, after taking much water and running great hazard at the mouth of the river, Caesar very reluctantly suffered the captain to put about. When he came back, the soldiers met him in throngs, finding much fault and sore displeased with him, because he did not believe that even with them alone he was able to conquer, but was troubled and risked his life for the sake of the absent, as though distrusting those who were present. Chapter 39. After this, Antony put in from Brundisium with his forces, and Caesar was emboldened to challenge Pompey to battle. Pompey was well posted and drew ample supplies, both from land and sea, while Caesar had no great abundance at first, and afterwards was actually hard-pressed for want of provisions. But his soldiers dug up a certain root, mixed it with milk, and ate it. Once, too, they made loaves of it, and running up to the enemy's outposts, threw the loaves inside, or tossed them to one another, adding, by way of comment, that as long as the earth produced such roots, they would not stop besieging Pompey. Pompey, however, would not allow either the loaves or these words to reach the main body of his army, for his soldiers were dejected, fearing the ferocity and hardiness of their enemies, who were like wild beasts in their eyes. There were constant skirmishings about the fortifications of Pompey, and in all of them Caesar got the better, except one, where there was a great rout of his men, and he was in danger of losing his camp. For when Pompey attacked, not one of Caesar's men stood his ground, but the moats were filled with the slain, and others were falling at their own ramparts and walls, whither they had been driven in headlong flight. And though Caesar met the fugitives and tried to turn them back, he availed nothing. Nay, when he tried to lay hold of the standards, the bearers threw them away, so that the enemy captured 32 of them. Caesar himself, too, narrowly escaped being killed, for as a tall and sturdy man was running away past him, he laid his hand upon him and bade him stay and face about upon the enemy. And the fellow, full of panic at the threatening danger, raised his sword to smite Caesar. But before he could do so, Caesar's shield-bearer lopped off his arm at the shoulder. So completely had Caesar given up his cause for lost, that when Pompey, either from excessive caution or by some chance, did not follow up his great success, but withdrew after he had shut up the fugitives within their entrenchments, Caesar said to his friends as he left them, "Today victory had been with the enemy, if they had had a victor in command." Then going by himself to his tent and lying down, he spent that most distressful of all nights in vain reflections, convinced that he had shown bad generalship. For while a fertile country lay waiting for him, and the prosperous cities of Macedonia and Thessaly, he had neglected to carry the war thither, and had posted himself here by the sea, which his enemies controlled with their fleets, being thus held in siege by lack of provisions, rather than besieging with his arms. Thus his despondent thoughts of the difficulty and perplexity of his situation kept him tossing upon his couch, and in the morning he broke camp, resolved to lead his army into Macedonia against Scipio, for he would then either draw Pompey after him to a place where he would give battle without drawing his supplies, as he now did from the sea, or Scipio would be left alone, and he would overwhelm him. Chapter 40. This emboldened the soldiers of Pompey and the leaders by whom he was surrounded to keep close to Caesar, whom they thought defeated and in flight. For Pompey himself was cautious about hazarding a battle for so great a stake. And since he was most excellently provided with everything necessary for a long war, he thought it best to wear out and quench the vigor of the enemy, which must be short-lived. For the best fighting men in Caesar's army had experience, it is true, and a daring which was irresistible in combat. But what with their long marches and frequent encampments and siege warfare and night watches, they were beginning to give out by reason of age, and were too unwieldy for labor, having lost their ardor from weakness. At that time, too, a kind of pestilential disease, occasioned by the strangeness of their diet, was said to be prevalent in Caesar's army. And what was most important of all, since Caesar was neither strong in funds nor well supplied with provisions, it was thought that within a short time his army would break up of itself. Chapter 41. For these reasons Pompey did not wish to fight, but Cato was the only one to commend his course, and this from a desire to spare the lives of his fellow citizens. For when he saw even those of the enemy who had fallen in the battle, to the number of 1,000, he burst into tears, muffled up his head, and went away. All the rest, however, reviled Pompey for trying to avoid a battle, and sought to goad him on by calling him Agamemnon and King of Kings, implying that he did not wish to lay aside his sole authority, but plumed himself on having so many commanders dependent upon him and coming constantly to his tent. And Favonius, affecting Cato's boldness of speech, complained like a madman, because that year also they would be unable to enjoy the figs of Tusculum because of Pompey's love of command. Afranius, too, who had lately come from Spain, where he had shown bad generalship, when accused of betraying his army for a bribe, asked why they did not fight with the merchant who had bought the provinces from him. Driven on by all these importunities, Pompey reluctantly sought a battle and pursued Caesar. Caesar accomplished most of his march with difficulty, since no one would sell him provisions, and everybody despised him on account of his recent defeat. But after he had taken Gomphi, a city of Thessaly, he not only provided food for his soldiers, but also relieved them of their disease unexpectedly, for they fell in with plenty of wine, and after drinking freely of it, and then reveling and rioting on their march by means of their drunkenness, they drove away and got rid of their trouble, since they brought their bodies into a different habit. Chapter 42. But when both armies entered the plain of Pharsalus and encamped there, Pompey's mind reverted again to its former reasoning, and besides there befell him unlucky appearances and a vision in his sleep. He dreamed, namely, that he saw himself in his theatre applauded by the Romans. Those about him, however, were so confident and so hopefully anticipated the victory that Domitius and Spinther and Scipio disputed earnestly with one another over Caesar's office of Pontifex Maximus. And many sent agents to Rome to hire and take possession of houses suitable for praetors and consuls, assuming that they would immediately hold these offices after the war. And most of all were his cavalry impatient for the battle, since they had a splendid array of shining armor, well-fed horses, and handsome persons, and were in high spirits too on account of their numbers, which were 7,000 to Caesar's 1,000. The numbers of the infantry also were unequal, since 45,000 were arrayed against 22,000. End of section 18. Section 19 of Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, Volume 7. This is the LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, Volume 7, by Lucius Mestrius PLUTARCHUS, translated by Bernadotte PERRIN. Caesar. Chapters 43 to 57. Chapter 43. Caesar called his soldiers together, and after telling them that Corfinius was near with 2 legions for him, and that 15 cohorts besides under Calenus were stationed at Athens and Megara, asked them whether they wished to wait for these troops, or to hazard the issue by themselves. Then the soldiers besought him with loud cries not to wait for the troops, but rather to contrive and maneuver to come to close quarters with the enemy as soon as possible. As he was holding a lustration and review of his forces, and had sacrificed the first victim, the seer at once told him that within 3 days there would be a decisive battle with the enemy. And when Caesar asked him whether he also saw in the victims any favorable signs of the issue, "Thou thyself," said the seer, "canst better answer this question for thyself, for the gods indicate a great change and revolution of the present status to the opposite. Therefore, if thou thinkest thyself well off as matters stand, expect the worse fortune; if badly off, the better." Moreover, on the night before the battle, as Caesar was making the round of his sentries about midnight, a fiery torch was seen in the heavens, which seemed to be carried over his camp, blazing out brightly, and then to fall into Pompey's. And during the morning watch it was noticed that there was actually a panic confusion among the enemy. However, Caesar did not expect to fight on that day, but began to break camp for a march to Scotussa. Chapter 44. But just as the tents had been struck, his scouts rode up to him with tidings that the enemy were coming down into the plain for battle. At this he was overjoyed, and after prayers and vows to the gods, drew up his legionaries in 3 divisions. Over the center he put Domitius Calvinus, while of the wings Antony had one, and he himself the right, where he intended to fight with the 10th legion. But seeing that the enemy's cavalry were arraying themselves over against this point, and fearing their brilliant appearance and their numbers, he ordered 6 cohorts from the furthermost lines to come round to him unobserved, and stationed them behind his right wing, teaching them what they were to do when the enemy's horsemen attacked. Pompey had one of his wings himself, and Domitius the left, while Scipio, Pompey's father-in-law, commanded the center. But his horsemen all crowded to the left wing, intending to encircle the enemy's right and make a complete rout about the commander himself, for they thought that no legionary army, however deep, could resist them, but that when so many horsemen made an onset together, the enemy would be utterly broken and crushed. When both sides were about to sound the charge, Pompey ordered his legionaries to stand with arms at the ready and await in close array the onset of the enemy until they were within javelin cast. But Caesar says that here too Pompey made a mistake, not knowing that the initial clash, with all the impetus of running, adds force to the blows and fires the courage, which everything then conspires to fan. As Caesar himself was about to move his lines of legionaries and was already going forward into action, he saw first one of his centurions, a man experienced in war and faithful to him, encouraging his men and challenging them to vie with him in prowess. Him Caesar addressed by name and said, Caius Crescinius, what are our hopes, and how does our confidence stand?" Then Crescinius, stretching forth his right hand, said with a loud voice, "We shall win a glorious victory, O Caesar, and thou shalt praise me today, whether I am alive or dead." So saying, he plunged foremost into the enemy at full speed, carrying along with him the 120 soldiers under his command. But after cutting his way through the first rank, and while he was forging onwards with great slaughter, he was beaten back by the thrust of a sword through his mouth, and the point of the sword actually came out at the back of his neck. Chapter 45. When the infantry had thus clashed together in the center and were fighting, Pompey's cavalry rode proudly up from the wing and deployed their squadrons to envelop the enemy's right, and before they could attack, the cohorts ran out from where Caesar was posted, not hurling their javelins as usual, nor yet stabbing the thighs and legs of their enemies with them, but aiming them at their eyes and wounding their faces. They had been instructed to do this by Caesar, who expected that men little conversant with war or wounds, but young and pluming themselves on their youthful beauty, would dread such wounds especially, and would not stand their ground, fearing not only their present danger but also their future disfigurement. And this was what actually came to pass, for they could not endure the upward thrust of the javelins, nor did they even venture to look the weapon in the face, but turned their heads away and covered them up to spare their faces. And finally, having thus thrown themselves into confusion, they turned and fled most shamefully, thereby ruining everything. For the conquerors of the horsemen at once encircled the infantry, fell upon their rear, and began to cut them to pieces. When Pompey on the other wing saw his horsemen scattered in flight, he was no longer the same man, nor remembered that he was Pompey the Great, but more like one whom heaven has robbed of his wits than anything else. He went off without a word to his tent, sat down there, and awaited what was to come, until his forces were all routed, and the enemy were assailing his ramparts and fighting with their defenders. Then he came to his senses, as it were, and with this one ejaculation, as they say, "What, even to my quarters?" took off his fighting and general's dress, put on one suitable for a fugitive, and stole away. What his subsequent fortunes were, and how he delivered himself into the hands of the Egyptians and was murdered, I shall tell in his life. Chapter 46. But Caesar, when he reached Pompey's ramparts and saw those of the enemy who were already lying dead there, and those who were still falling, said with a groan, "They would have it so. They brought me to such a pass, that if I, Caius Caesar, after waging successfully the greatest wars, had dismissed my forces, I should have been condemned in their courts." Asinius Pollio says that these words, which Caesar afterwards wrote down in Greek, were uttered by him in Latin at the time. He also says that most of the slain were servants who were killed at the taking of the camp, and that not more than 6,000 soldiers fell. Most of those who were taken alive Caesar incorporated in his legions, and to many men of prominence he granted immunity. One of these was Brutus, who afterwards slew him. Caesar was distressed, we are told, when Brutus was not to be found, but when he was brought into his presence safe and sound, was pleased beyond measure. Chapter 47. There were many portents of the victory, but the most remarkable one on record is that which was seen at Tralles. In that city's temple of victory there stood a statue of Caesar, and the ground around it was itself naturally firm, and was paved with hard stone. Yet from this it is said that a palm tree shot up at the base of the statue. Moreover, at Patavium, Caius Cornelius, a man in repute as a seer, a fellow citizen and acquaintance of Livy the historian, chanced that day to be sitting in the place of augury, and to begin with, according to Livy, He discerned the time of the battle, and said to those present that even then the event was in progress, and the men were going into action. And when he looked again and observed the signs, he sprang up in a rapture, crying, "Thou art victorious, O Caesar!" The bystanders being amazed, he took the chaplet from his head and declared with an oath that he would not put it on again until the event had borne witness to his art. At any rate, Livy insists that this was so. Footnote. In Book 111, which is lost. End footnote. Chapter 48. Caesar gave the Thessalians their freedom to commemorate his victory, and then pursued Pompey. When he reached Asia, he made the Cnidians also free, to please Theopompus, the collector of fables, and for all the inhabitants of Asia remitted 1/3 of their taxes. Arriving at Alexandria just after Pompey's death, he turned away in horror from Theodotus as he presented the head of Pompey, but he accepted Pompey's seal ring and shed tears over it. Moreover, all the companions and intimates of Pompey who had been captured by the king as they wandered over the country, he treated with kindness and attached them to himself. And to his friends in Rome he wrote that this was the greatest and sweetest pleasure that he derived from his victory, namely, from time to time to save the lives of fellow citizens who had fought against him. As for the war in Egypt, some say that it was not necessary, but due to Caesar's passion for Cleopatra, and that it was inglorious and full of peril for him. But others blame the king's party for it, and especially the eunuch Pothienus, who had most influence at court, and had recently killed Pompey. He had also driven Cleopatra from the country, and was now secretly plotting against Caesar. On this account they say that from this time on, Caesar passed whole nights at drinking parties, in order to protect himself. But in his open acts also, Pothienus was unbearable, since he said and did many things that were invidious and insulting to Caesar. For instance, when the soldiers had the oldest and worst grain measured out to them, he bade them put up with it and be content, since they were eating what belonged to others. And at the state suppers he used wooden and earthen dishes, on the ground that Caesar had taken all the gold and silverware in payment of a debt. For the father of the present king owed Caesar 17,500,000 drachmas. Footnote. During Caesar's consulship, 59 B.C., Ptolemy Auletes was declared a friend and ally of the Romans. To secure this honor, he both gave and promised money to the state. End footnote. Of which Caesar had formerly remitted a part to his children, but now demanded payment of 10 millions for the support of his army. When, however, Pothienus bade him go away now and attend to his great affairs, assuring him that later he would get his money with thanks, Caesar replied that he had no need whatever of Egyptians as advisers, and secretly sent for Cleopatra from the country. Chapter 49. So Cleopatra, taking only Apollodorus the Sicilian from among her friends, embarked in a little skiff and landed at the palace when it was already getting dark, and as it was impossible to escape notice otherwise, she stretched herself at full length inside a bed-sack, while Apollodorus tied the bed-sack up with a cord and carried it indoors to Caesar. It was by this device of Cleopatra's, it is said, that Caesar was first captivated, for she showed herself to be a bold coquette, and succumbing to the charm of further intercourse with her, he reconciled her to her brother on the basis of a joint share with him in the royal power. Then, as everybody was feasting to celebrate the reconciliation, a slave of Caesar's, his barber, who left nothing unscrutinized, owing to a timidity in which he had no equal, but kept his ears open, and was here, there, and everywhere, perceived that Achillas the general and Pothienus the eunuch were hatching a plot against Caesar. After Caesar had found them out, he set a guard about the banqueting hall, and put Pothienus to death, Achillas, however, escaped to his camp, and raised about Caesar a war grievous and difficult for one who was defending himself with so few followers against so large a city and army. In this war, to begin with, Caesar encountered the peril of being shut off from water, since the canals were dammed up by the enemy. In the second place, when the enemy tried to cut off his fleet, he was forced to repel the danger by using fire, and this spread from the dockyards and destroyed the great library. Footnote. In the museum founded by the first Ptolemy, 283 BC, the destruction of the library can have been only partial. End footnote. And thirdly, when a battle arose at Pharos, footnote, an island off Alexandria, connected with the mainland by a mole or causeway, which divided the harbor into two parts. End footnote. He sprang from the mole into a small boat and tried to go to the aid of his men in their struggle, but the Egyptians sailed up against him from every side, so that he threw himself into the sea, and with great difficulty escaped by swimming. At this time, too, it is said that he was holding many papers in his hand and would not let them go, though missiles were flying at him, and he was immersed in the sea, but held them above water with one hand and swam with the other. His little boat had been sunk at the outset, but finally, after the king had gone away to the enemy, he marched against him and conquered him in a battle where many fell, and the king himself disappeared. Then, leaving Cleopatra on the throne of Egypt, a little later she had a son by him, whom the Alexandrians called Caesarion. He set out for Syria. Chapter 50. On leaving that country and traversing Asia, he learned that Domitius had been defeated by Pharnaces, the son of Mithridates, and had fled from Pontus with a few followers. Also that Pharnaces, using his victory without stint, and occupying Bithynia and Cappadocia, was aiming to secure the country called Lesser Armenia, and was rousing to revolt all the princes and tetrarchs there. At once, therefore, Caesar marched against him with 3 legions, fought a great battle with him near the city of Zela, drove him in flight out of Pontus, and annihilated his army. In announcing the swiftness and fierceness of this battle to one of his friends at Rome, Amantius, Caesar wrote 3 words: came, saw, conquered. Footnote. Veni, vidi, vici. According to Suetonius, the words were displayed in Caesar's Pontic triumph. End footnote. In Latin, however, the words have the same inflectional ending, and so a brevity which is most impressive. Chapter 51. After this he crossed to Italy, and went up to Rome at the close of the year for which he had a second time been chosen dictator. Footnote. The Senate named Caesar dictator for the year 47, immediately after the battle of Pharsalus. End footnote. Though that office had never before been for a whole year. Then for the following year he was proclaimed consul. Men spoke ill of him, because after his soldiers had mutinied and killed 2 men of praetorian rank, Galba and Cosconius, he censured them only so far as to call them citizens when he addressed them, instead of soldiers, and then gave each man 1,000 drachmas and much allotted land in Italy. He was also calumniated for the madness of Dolabella, the greed of Amantius, the drunkenness of Antony, and for the fact that Corfinius built over and refurnished the house of Pompey on the ground that it was not good enough for him. But at all these things the Romans were displeased. But owing to the political situation, though Caesar was not ignorant of these things and did not like them, he was compelled to make use of such assistance. Chapter 42. After the battle at Pharsalus, Cato and Scipio made their escape to Africa, and there, with the aid of King Juba, collected considerable forces. Caesar therefore resolved to make an expedition against them. So, about the time of the winter solstice, he crossed into Sicily, and wishing to cut off at once in the minds of his officers all hope of delaying there and wasting time, he pitched his own tent on the sea beach. When a favoring wind arose, he embarked and put to sea, with 3,000 infantry and a few horsemen. Then, after landing these unobserved, he put to sea again, being full of fears for the larger part of his force, and meeting them after they were already at sea, he conducted all into camp. On learning that the enemy were emboldened by an ancient oracle to the effect that it was always the prerogative of the family of the Scipios to conquer in Africa, he either flouted in pleasantry the Scipio who commanded the enemy, or else tried in good earnest to appropriate to himself the omen, it is hard to say which. He had under him, namely, a man who otherwise was a contemptible nobody, but belonged to the family of the Africani, and was called Scipio Celestio. This man Caesar put in the forefront of his battles, as if commander of the army, being compelled to attack the enemy frequently and to force the fighting. For there was neither sufficient food for his men, nor fodder for his beasts of burden. Nay, they were forced to feed their horses on seaweed, which they washed free of its salt and mixed with a little grass to sweeten it. For the Numidians showed themselves everywhere in great numbers and speedy, and controlled the country. Indeed, while Caesar's horsemen were once off duty, a Libyan was showing them how he could dance and play the flute at the same time in an astonishing manner, and they had committed their horses to the slaves and were sitting delighted on the ground. The enemy suddenly surrounded and attacked them, killed some of them, and followed hard upon the heels of the rest as they were driven headlong into camp. And if Caesar himself, and with him Asinius Pollio, had not come from the ramparts to their aid and checked their flight, the war would have been at an end. On one occasion, too, in another battle, the enemy got the advantage of the encounter, and here it is said that Caesar, seized by the neck the fugitive standard-bearer, faced him about and said, "Yonder is the enemy." Chapter 53. However, Scipio was encouraged by these advantages to hazard a decisive battle. So leaving Afranius and Juba encamped separately at a short distance apart, he himself began fortifying a camp beyond a lake near the city of Thapsus, that it might serve the whole army as a place from which to sally out to the battle, and as a place of refuge. But while he was busy with this project, Caesar made his way with inconceivable speed through woody regions which afforded unknown access to the spot, outflanked some of the enemy, and attacked others in front. Then, after routing these, he took advantage of the favorable instant and of the impetus of fortune, and thereby captured the camp of Afranius, and at the first onset sacked the camp of the Numidians, from which Juba fled. Thus, in a brief portion of one day, he made himself master of 3 camps, and slew 50,000 of the enemy, without losing as many as 50 of his own men. Footnote: in April of 46 B.C. End footnote. This is the account which some give of the battle. Others, however, say that Caesar himself was not in the action, but that, as he was marshalling and arraying his army, his usual sickness laid hold of him, and he, at once aware that it was beginning, before his already wavering senses were altogether confounded and overpowered by the malady, was carried to a neighboring tower, where he stayed quietly during the battle. Of the men of consular and praetorial rank who escaped from the battle, some slew themselves at the moment of their capture, and others were put to death by Caesar after capture. Chapter 54. Being eager to take Cato alive, Caesar hastened towards Utica, for Cato was guarding that city and took no part in the battle. But he learned that Cato had made away with himself, and he was clearly annoyed, though for what reason is uncertain. At any rate, he said, "Cato, I begrudge thee thy death, for thou didst begrudge me the preservation of thy life." Now the treatise which Caesar afterwards wrote against Cato, when he was dead, does not seem to prove that he was in a gentle or reconciliable mood, for how could he have spared Cato alive, when he poured out against him after death so great a cup of wrath? And yet, from his considerate treatment of Cicero and Brutus, and thousands more who had fought against him, it is inferred that even this treatise was not composed out of hatred, but from political ambition, for reasons which follow. Cicero had written an encomium on Cato, which he entitled Cato, and the discourse was eagerly read by many, as was natural, since it was composed by the ablest of orators, on the noblest of themes. This annoyed Caesar, who thought that Cicero's praise of the dead Cato was a denunciation of Caesar himself. Accordingly, he wrote a treatise in which he got together countless charges against Cato, and the work is entitled Anti-Cato. Both treatises have many eager readers, as well on account of Caesar as of Cato. Chapter 55. But to resume, when Caesar came back to Rome from Africa, to begin with, he made a boastful speech to the people concerning his victory, asserting that he had subdued a country large enough to furnish annually for the public treasury 200,000 Attic bushels of grain, and 3,000,000 pounds of olive oil. Next, he celebrated triumphs, an Egyptian, a Pontic, and an African, the last not for his victory over Scipio, but ostensibly over Juba, the king. On this occasion, too, Juba, a son of the king, a mere infant, was carried along in the triumphal procession, the most fortunate captive ever taken, since from being a barbarian and a Numidian, he came to be enrolled among the most learned historians of Hellas. After the triumphs, Caesar gave his soldiers large gifts and entertained the people with banquets and spectacles, feasting them all at one time on 20,000 dining couches, and furnishing spectacles of gladiatorial and naval combats in honor of his daughter Julia, long since dead. After the spectacles, a census of the people was taken. Footnote. According to Suetonius, this was not a census of all the people, but a revision of the number of poorer citizens entitled to receive allowances of grain from the state. End footnote. And instead of 320,000 of the preceding lists, there were enrolled only 150,000. So great was the calamity which the civil wars had wrought, and so large a portion of the people of Rome had they consumed away, to say nothing of the misfortunes that possessed the rest of Italy and the provinces. Chapter 56. After these matters had been finished, and he had been declared consul for the 4th time, Caesar made an expedition into Spain against the sons of Pompey. These were still young, but had collected an army of amazing numbers and displayed a boldness which justified their claims to leadership, so that they beset Caesar with the greatest peril. The great battle was joined near the city of Munda, and here Caesar, seeing his own men hard pressed and making a feeble resistance, asked in a loud voice, as he ran through the armed ranks, whether they felt no shame to take him and put him in the hands of those boys. With difficulty and after much strenuous effort, he repulsed the enemy and slew over 30,000 of them. But he lost 1,000 of his own men, and those the very best. As he was going away after the battle, he said to his friends that he had often striven for victory, but now, first, for his life. He fought this victorious battle on the day of the festival of Bacchus, footnote, March 17th, 45 B.C., end footnote, on which day also it is said that Pompey the Great had gone forth to the war. A period of 4 years intervened. As for Pompey's sons, the younger made his escape, but after a few days the head of the elder was brought in by Didius. This was the last war that Caesar waged, and the triumph that was celebrated for it vexed the Romans as nothing else had done, for it commemorated no victory over foreign commanders or barbarian kings, but the utter annihilation of the sons and the family of the mightiest of the Romans, who had fallen upon misfortune. And it was not meet for Caesar to celebrate a triumph for the calamities of his country, priding himself upon actions which had no defense before gods or men, except that they had been done under necessity, and that too, although previously he had sent neither messenger nor letters to announce to the people of victory in the civil wars, but had scrupulously put from him the fame arising therefrom. Chapter 57. However, the Romans gave way before the good fortune of the man and accepted the bit, and regarding the monarchy as a respite from the evils of the civil wars, they appointed him dictator for life. This was confessedly a tyranny, since the monarchy, besides the element of irresponsibility, now took on that of permanence. It was Cicero who proposed the first honors for him in the Senate, and their magnitude was, after all, not too great for a man. But others added excessive honors and vied with one another in proposing them, thus rendering Caesar odious and obnoxious even to the mildest citizens, because of the pretension and extravagance of what was decreed for him. It is thought, too, that the enemies of Caesar, no less than his flatterers, helped to force these measures through, in order that they might have as many pretexts as possible against him, and might be thought to have the best reasons for attempting his life. For in all other ways, at least, after the civil wars were over, he showed himself blameless, and certainly it is thought not inappropriate that the temple of clemency was decreed as a thank-offering in view of his mildness. For he pardoned many of those who had fought against him, and to some he even gave honors and offices besides, as to Brutus and Cassius, both of whom were now praetors. The statues of Pompey, too, which had been thrown down, he would not suffer to remain so, but set them up again, at which Cicero said that in setting up Pompey's statues, Caesar firmly fixed his own. When his friends thought it best that he should have a bodyguard, and many of them volunteered for this service, he would not consent, saying that it was better to die once for all than to be always expecting death. And in the effort to surround himself with men's good will as the fairest and at the same time the securest protection, he again courted the people with banquets and distributions of grain, and his soldiers with newly planted colonies, the most conspicuous of which were Carthage and Corinth. The earlier capture of both these cities, as well as their present restoration, chanced to fall at one and the same time. Footnote. Both cities were captured in 146 BC, and both were restored in 44 BC. End footnote. End of section 19. Section 20 of Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, Volume 7. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, Volume 7, by Lucius Mestrius PLUTARCHUS, translated by Bernadotte, PERRIN. Caesar. Chapters 58 to 69. Chapter 58. As for the nobles, to some of them he promised consulships and praetorships in the future. Others he appeased with sundry other powers and honors, and in all he implanted hopes, since he ardently desired to rule over willing subjects. Therefore, when Maximus the consul died, he appointed Caninius Revilius consul, for the one day still remaining of the term of office. To him, as we are told, many were going with congratulations and offers of escort, whereupon Cicero said, "Let us make haste, or else the man's consulship will have expired." Caesar's many successes, however, did not divert his natural spirit of enterprise and ambition to the enjoyment of what he had laboriously achieved, but served as fuel and incentive for future achievements, and begat in him plans for greater deeds and a passion for fresh glory, as though he had used up what he already had. What he felt was therefore nothing else than emulation of himself, as if he had been another man, and a sort of rivalry between what he had done and what he purposed to do. For he planned and prepared to make an expedition against the Parthians, and after subduing these and marching around the Euxine by way of Hyrcania, the Caspian Sea, and the Caucasus, to invade Scythia, and after overrunning the countries bordering on Germany and Germany itself, to come back by way of Gaul to Italy, and so to complete this circuit of his empire, which would then be bounded on all sides by the ocean. During this expedition, moreover, he intended to dig through the Isthmus of Corinth, and had already put Aeneas in charge of this work. He intended also to divert the Tiber just below the city into a deep channel, give it a bend towards Circeum, and make it empty into the sea at Terracina, thus contriving for merchantmen a safe as well as an easy passage to Rome. and besides this, to convert the marshes about Pomentinum and Satia into a plain which many thousands of men could cultivate, and farther, to build moles which should barricade the sea where it was nearest to Rome, to clear away the hidden dangers on the shore of Ostia, and then construct harbors and roadsteads sufficient for the great fleets that would visit them. And all these things were in preparation. Chapter 59. The adjustment of the calendar, however, and the correction of the irregularity in the computation of time were not only studied scientifically by him, but also brought to completion, and proved to be of the highest utility, for not only in very ancient times was the relation of the lunar to the solar year in great confusion among the Romans, so that the sacrificial feasts and festivals, diverging gradually, at last fell in opposite seasons of the year. But also at this time people generally had no way of computing the actual solar year. Footnote. At this time the Roman calendar was more than 2 months ahead of the solar year. Caesar's reform went into effect in 46 B.C. End footnote. The priests alone knew the proper time, and would suddenly, and to everybody's surprise, insert the intercalary month called Mercedonius. Numa, the king, is said to have been the first to intercalate this month, thus devising a slight and short-lived remedy for the error in regard to the sidereal and solar cycles, as I have said in his life. But Caesar laid the problem before the best philosophers and mathematicians, and out of the methods of correction which were already at hand, compounded one of his own, which was more accurate than any. This the Romans use down to the present time, and are thought to be less in error than other peoples as regards the inequality between the lunar and solar years. However, even this furnished occasion for blame to those who envied Caesar and disliked his power. At any rate, Cicero the orator, we are told, when someone remarked that Lyra would rise on the morrow, said, "Yes, by decree," implying that men were compelled to accept even this dispensation. Chapter 60. But the most open and deadly hatred towards him was produced by his passion for the royal power. For the multitude this was the first cause of hatred, and for those who had long smothered their hate, a most specious pretext for it. And yet those who were advocating this honor for Caesar actually spread abroad among the people a report that from the Sibylline books it appeared that Parthia could be taken if the Romans went up against it with a king, but otherwise could not be assailed. And as Caesar was coming down from Alba into the city, they ventured to hail him as a king. But at this the people were confounded, and Caesar, disturbed in mind, said that his name was not King, but Caesar. And seeing that his words produced an universal silence, he passed on with no very cheerful or contented looks. Moreover, after sundry extravagant honors had been voted him in the Senate, it chanced that he was sitting above the rostra, and as the praetors and consuls drew near, with the whole Senate following them, he did not rise to receive them, but as if he were dealing with mere private persons, replied that his honors needed curtailment rather than enlargement. This vexed not only the Senate, but also the people, who felt that in the persons of the senators the state was insulted. And in a terrible dejection they went away at once, all who were not obliged to remain, so that Caesar too, when he was aware of his mistake, immediately turned to go home, and drawing back his toga from his neck, cried in loud tones to his friends that he was ready to offer his throat to anyone who wished to kill him. But afterwards he made his disease an excuse for his behavior, saying that the senses of those who are thus afflicted do not usually remain steady when they address a multitude standing, but are speedily shaken and whirled about, bringing on giddiness and insensibility. However, what he said was not true. On the contrary, he was very desirous of rising to receive the Senate, but one of his friends, as they say, or rather one of his flatterers, Cornelius Balbus, restrained him, saying, "Remember that thou art Caesar, and permit thyself to be courted as a superior." Chapter 61. There was added to these causes of offense his insult to the tribunes. It was, namely, the festival of the Lupercalia, of which many write that it was anciently celebrated by shepherds, and has also some connection to the Arcadian Lycia. At this time many of the noble youths and of the magistrates ran up and down through the city naked, for sport and laughter, striking those they meet with shaggy thongs. And many women of rank also purposely get in their way, and like children at school present their hands to be struck, believing that the pregnant will thus be helped to an easy delivery, and the barren to pregnancy. These ceremonies Caesar was witnessing, seated upon the rostra on a golden throne, arrayed in triumphal attire. And Antony was one of the runners in the sacred race, for he was consul. Accordingly, after he had dashed into the forum, and the crowd had made way for him, he carried a diadem, round which a wreath of laurel was tied, and held it out to Caesar. Then there was applause, not loud, but slight and preconcerted. But when Caesar pushed away the diadem, all the people applauded. And when Antony offered it again, few. And when Caesar declined it again, all applauded. The experiment having thus failed, Caesar rose from his seat, after ordering the wreath to be carried up to the Capitol. But then his statues were seen to have been decked with royal diadems. So two of the tribunes, Flavius and Marillus, went up to them and pulled off the diadems, and after discovering those who had first hailed Caesar as king, led them off to prison. Moreover, the people followed the tribunes with applause, and called them Brutuses, because Brutus was the man who put an end to the royal succession, and brought the power into the hands of the Senate and people instead of a sole ruler. At this Caesar was greatly vexed, and deprived Marillus and Flavius of their office, while in his denunciation of them, although he at the same time insulted the people, he called them repeatedly brutes and simians. Chapter 62. Under these circumstances, the multitude turned their thoughts towards Marcus Brutus, who was thought to be a descendant of the elder Brutus on his father's side. On his mother's side belonged to the Servilii, another illustrious house, and was a son-in-law and nephew of Cato. The desires which Brutus felt to attempt of his own accord the abolition of the monarchy were blunted by the favors and honors that he had received from Caesar, for not only had his life been spared at Pharsalus after Pompey's flight, and the lives of many of his friends at his entreaty, but also he had great credit with Caesar. He had received the most honorable of the praetorships for the current year, and was to be consul 3 years later, having been preferred to Cassius, who was a rival candidate. For Caesar, as we are told, said that Cassius urged the juster claims to the office, but that for his own part he could not pass Brutus by. Once, too, when certain persons were actually accusing Brutus to him, the conspiracy being already on foot, Caesar would not heed them, but laying his hand upon his body, said to the accusers, "Brutus will wait for this shriveled skin," implying that Brutus was worthy to rule because of his virtue, but that for the sake of ruling he would not become a thankless villain. Those, however, who were eager for the change, and fixed their eyes on Brutus alone, or on him first, did not venture to talk with him directly, but by night they covered his praetorial tribune and chair with writings, most of which were of this sort: "Thou art asleep, Brutus," or "Thou art not Brutus." When Cassius perceived that the ambition of Brutus was somewhat stirred by these things, he was more urgent with him than before, and pricked him on, having himself also some private grounds for hating Caesar. These I have mentioned in the life of Brutus. Moreover, Caesar actually suspected him, so that he once said to his friends, "What, think ye, doth Cassius want? I like him not overmuch, for he is much too pale." And again we are told that when Antony and Dolabella were accused to him of plotting revolution, Caesar said, "I am not much in fear of these fat, long-haired fellows, but rather of those pale, thin ones," meaning Brutus and Cassius. Chapter 63. But destiny, it would seem, is not so much unexpected as it is unavoidable, since they say that amazing signs and apparitions were seen. Now, as for lights in the heavens, crashing sounds borne all about by night, and birds of omen coming down into the forum, it is perhaps not worthwhile to mention these precursors of so great an event. But Strabo the philosopher says that multitudes of men, all on fire, were seen rushing up, and a soldier's slave threw from his hand a copious flame, and seemed to the spectators to be burning. But when the flame ceased, the man was uninjured. He says, moreover, that when Caesar himself was sacrificing, the heart of the victim was not to be found. And the prodigy caused fear, since in the course of nature certainly an animal without a heart could not exist. The following story, too, is told by many. A certain seer warned Caesar to be on his guard against a great peril on the day of the month of March, which the Romans call the Ides. And when the day had come, and Caesar was on his way to the Senate house, he greeted the seer with a jest, and said, "Well, the Ides of March are come." And the seer said to him softly, "Aye, they are come, but they are not gone." Moreover, on the day before, when Marcus Lepidus was entertaining him at supper, Caesar chanced to be signing letters, as his custom was, while reclining at table, and the discourse turned suddenly upon the question of what sort of death was the best. Before anyone else could answer, Caesar cried out, "That which is unexpected." After this, while he was sleeping as usual by the side of his wife, all the windows and doors of the chamber flew open at once. And Caesar, confounded by the noise and the light of the moon shining down upon him, noticed that Calpurnia was in a deep slumber, but was uttering indistinct words and inarticulate groans in her sleep, for she dreamed, as it proved, that she was holding her murdered husband in her arms and bewailing him. Some, however, say that this was not the vision which the woman had, but that there was attached to Caesar's house, to give it adornment and distinction, by vote of the Senate, a gable ornament, as Livy says, and it was this which Calpurnia in her dreams saw torn down, and therefore, as she thought, wailed and wept. At all events, when day came, she begged Caesar, if it was possible, not to go out, but to postpone the meeting of the Senate. If, however, he had no concern at all for her dreams, she besought him to inquire by other modes of divination and by sacrifices concerning the future. And Caesar also, as it would appear, was in some suspicion and fear, for never before had he perceived in Calpurnia any womanish superstition, but now he saw that she was in great distress. And when the seers also, after many sacrifices, told him that the omens were unfavorable, he resolved to send Antony and dismiss the Senate. Chapter 64. But at this juncture Decimus Brutus, surnamed Albinus, who was so trusted by Caesar that he was entered in his will as his second heir, but was partner in the conspiracy of the other Brutus and Cassius, fearing that if Caesar should elude that day, their undertaking would become known, ridiculed the seers and chided Caesar for laying himself open to malicious charges on the part of the senators, who would think themselves mocked at, for they had met at his bidding, and were ready and willing to vote as one man that he should be declared king of the provinces outside of Italy, and might wear a diadem when he went anywhere else by land or sea. But if someone should tell them at their session to be gone now, but to come back again when Calpurnia should have better dreams, what speeches would be made by his enemies, or who would listen to his friends when they tried to show that this was not slavery and tyranny. But if he was fully resolved, Albinus said, to regard the day as inauspicious, it was better that he should go in person and address the Senate, and then postpone its business. While saying these things, Brutus took Caesar by the hand and began to lead him along, and he had gone but a little way from his door when a slave, belonging to someone else, eager to get at Caesar, but unable to do so for the press of numbers about him, forced his way into the house, gave himself into the hands of Calpurnia, and bade her keep him secure until Caesar came back, since he had important matters to report to him. Chapter 65. Furthermore, Artemidorus, a Cnidian by birth, a teacher of Greek philosophy, and on this account brought into intimacy with some of the followers of Brutus, so that he also knew most of what they were doing, came bringing to Caesar in a small roll the disclosures which he was going to make. But seeing that Caesar took all such rolls and handed them to his attendants, he came quite near and said, "Read this, Caesar, by thyself, and speedily, for it contains matters of importance and of concern to thee." Accordingly, Caesar took the roll and would have read it, but was prevented by the multitude of people who engaged his attention, although he set out to do so many times, and holding in his hand and retaining that roll alone, he passed on into the Senate. Some, however, say that another person gave him this roll, and that Artemidorus did not get to him at all, but was crowded away all along the route. Chapter 66. So far, perhaps, these things may have happened of their own accord. The place, however, which was the scene of that struggle and murder, and in which the Senate was then assembled, since it contained a statue of Pompey, and had been dedicated by Pompey as an additional ornament to his theatre, made it wholly clear that it was the work of some heavenly power which was calling and guiding the action thither. Indeed, it is also said that Cassius, turning his eyes towards the statue of Pompey before the attack began, invoked it silently, although he was much addicted to the doctrines of Epicurus. But the crisis, as it would seem, when the dreadful attempt was now close at hand, replaced his former cool calculations with divinely inspired emotion. Well, then, Antony, who was a friend of Caesar's and a robust man, was detained outside by Brutus Albinus, who purposely engaged him in a lengthy conversation. But Caesar went in, and the Senate rose in his honor. Some of the partisans of Brutus took their places round the back of Caesar's chair, while others went to meet him as though they would support the petition which Tullius Cimber presented to Caesar in behalf of his exiled brother, and they joined their entreaties to his, and accompanied Caesar up to his chair. But when, after taking his seat, Caesar continued to repulse their petitions, and as they pressed upon him with greater importunity, began to show anger towards one and another of them, Tullius seized his toga with both hands and pulled it down from his neck. This was the signal for the assault. It was Casca who gave him the first blow with his dagger in the neck, not a mortal wound, nor even a deep one, for which he was too much confused, as was natural at the beginning of a deed of great daring, so that Caesar turned about, grasped the knife, and held it fast. At almost the same instant both cried out, the smitten man in Latin, "Accursed Casca, what doest thou?" But the smiter in Greek to his brother, "Brother, help!" So the affair began, and those who were not privy to the plot were filled with consternation and horror at what was going on. They dared not fly, nor go to Caesar's help, nay, nor even utter a word. But those who had prepared themselves for the murder bared each of them his dagger, and Caesar, hemmed in on all sides, whichever way he turned, confronting blows of weapons aimed at his face and eyes, driven hither and thither like a wild beast, was entangled in the hands of all, for all had to take part in the sacrifice and taste of the slaughter. Therefore Brutus also gave him one blow in the groin. And it is said by some writers that although Caesar defended himself against the rest, and darted this way and that, and cried aloud, when he saw that Brutus had drawn his dagger, he pulled his toga down over his head and sank, either by chance or because pushed there by his murderers, against the pedestal on which the statue of Pompey stood. And the pedestal was drenched with his blood, so that one might have thought that Pompey himself was presiding over this vengeance upon his enemy, who now lay prostrate at his feet, quivering from a multitude of wounds. For it is said that he received 23, and many of the conspirators were wounded by one another as they struggled to plant all those blows in one body. Chapter 67. Caesar thus done to death, the senators, although Brutus came forward as if to say something about what had been done, would not wait to hear him, but burst out of doors and fled, thus filling the people with confusion and helpless fear, so that some of them closed their houses, while others left their counters and places of business and ran, first to the place to see what had happened, and then away from the place when they had seen. Antony and Lepidus, the chief friends of Caesar, stole away and took refuge in the houses of others. But Brutus and his partisans, just as they were, still warm from the slaughter, displaying their daggers bare, went all in a body out of the Senate house and marched to the Capitol, not like fugitives, but with glad faces and full of confidence, summoning the multitude to freedom, and welcoming into their ranks the most distinguished of those who met them. Some also joined their number and went up with them as though they had shared in the deed, and laid claim to the glory of it, of whom were Caius Octavius and Lentulus Spinther. These men, then, paid the penalty for their imposture later, when they were put to death by Antony and the young Caesar, without even enjoying the fame for the sake of which they died, owing to the disbelief of their fellow men. For even those who punished them did not exact a penalty for what they did, but for what they wished they had done. On the next day Brutus came down and held a discourse, and the people listened to what was said, without either expressing resentment at what had been done, or appearing to approve of it. They showed, however, by their deep silence, that while they pitied Caesar, they respected Brutus. The Senate, too, trying to make a general amnesty and reconciliation, voted to give Caesar divine honors, and not to disturb even the most insignificant measure which he had adopted when in power. While to Brutus and his partisans it distributed provinces and gave suitable honors, so that everybody thought that matters were decided and settled in the best possible manner. Chapter 68. But when the will of Caesar was opened, and it was found that he had given every Roman citizen a considerable gift, and when the multitude saw his body carried through the forum, all disfigured with its wounds, they no longer kept themselves within the restraints of order and discipline, but after heaping round the body benches, railings, and tables from the forum, they set fire to them and burned it there. Then lifting blazing brands on high, they ran to the houses of the murderers with intent to burn them down, while others went every whither through the city, seeking to seize the men themselves and tear them to pieces. Not one of these came in their way, but all were well barricaded. There was a certain Cinna, however, one of the friends of Caesar, who chanced, as they say, to have seen during the previous night a strange vision. He dreamed, that is, that he was invited to supper by Caesar, and that when he excused himself, Caesar led him along by the hand, although he did not wish to go, but resisted. Now, when he heard that they were burning the body of Caesar in the forum, he rose up and went thither out of respect, although he had misgivings arising from his vision, and was at the same time in a fever, At sight of him, one of the multitude told his name to another, who asked him what it was, and he to another, and at once word ran through the whole throng that this man was one of the murderers of Caesar. For there was among the conspirators a man who bore this same name of Cinna, and assuming that this man was he, the crowd rushed upon him and tore him in pieces among them. This, more than anything else, made Brutus and Cassius afraid, and not many days afterwards they withdrew from the city. What they did and suffered before they died has been told in the Life of Brutus. Chapter 69. At the time of his death, Caesar was fully 56 years old, but he had survived Pompey not much more than 4 years, while of the power and dominion which he had sought all his life, at so great risks, and barely achieved at last, of this he had reaped no fruit but the name of it only, and a glory which had awakened envy on the part of his fellow citizens. However, the great guardian genius of the man, whose help he had enjoyed through life, followed upon him even after death as an avenger of his murder, driving and tracking down his slayers over every land and sea, until not one of them was left, but even those who in any way soever either put hand to the deed or took part in the plot were punished. Among events of man's ordering, the most amazing was that which befell Cassius. For after his defeat at Philippi, he slew himself with that very dagger which he had used against Caesar. And among events of divine ordering, there was the great comet, which showed itself in great splendor for 7 nights after Caesar's murder, and then disappeared, and also the obscuration of the sun's rays. For during all that year its orb rose pale and without radiance, while the heat that came down from it was slight and ineffectual, so that the air in its circulation was dark and heavy, owing to the feebleness of the warmth that penetrated it, and the fruits, imperfect and half-ripe, withered away and shriveled up, on account of the coldness of the atmosphere. But more than anything else, the phantom that appeared to Brutus showed that the murder of Caesar was not pleasing to the gods. And it was on this wise. As he was about to take his army across from Abydos to the other continent, he was lying down at night, as his custom was, in his tent, not sleeping but thinking of the future. For it is said that of all generals Brutus was the least given to sleep, and that he naturally remained awake a longer time than anybody else. And now he thought he heard a noise at the door, and looking towards the light of the lamp, which was slowly going out, he saw a fearful vision of a man of unnatural size and harsh aspect. At first he was terrified, but when he saw that the visitor neither did nor said anything, but stood in silence by his couch, he asked him who he was. Then the phantom answered him, "I am thy evil genius, Brutus, and thou shalt see me at Philippi." At the same time, then, Brutus said courageously, "I shall see thee." And the heavenly visitor at once went away. Subsequently, however, when arrayed against Antony and Caesar at Philippi in the first battle, he conquered the enemy in his front, routed and scattered them, and sacked the camp of Caesar. But as he was about to fight the second battle, the same phantom visited him again at night, and though it said nothing to him, Brutus understood his fate, and plunged headlong into danger. He did not fall in battle, however, but after the rout retired to a crest of ground, put his naked sword to his breast, while a certain friend, as they say, helped to drive the blow home, and so died. End of section 20. Recording by Carol Pelster. End of Parallel Lives of the Noble Greeks and Romans, Volume 7, by Lucius Mestrius Plutarchus, translated by Bernadotte, PERRIN, 1847 to 1920.